My stepfather taught my son to refuse food I cooked because it was poisoned. It started with Ethan pushing away his breakfast. He was 5 years old and had always loved my blueberry pancakes. That morning in early February, he stared at the stack I'd placed in front of him and shook his head. I asked what was wrong, and he said the pancakes looked funny. I examined them and saw nothing unusual. Same golden brown color, same scattered blueberries, same butter melting on top. I told him they were exactly like always, and he should eat before they got cold. Ethan's face scrunched up, and he said he didn't feel safe eating them. The word safe struck me as odd. 5-year-olds didn't typically use that kind of language about food. I asked where he learned that word, and he looked down at his plate. He said Grandpa Nolan told him that sometimes food isn't safe, even when it looks normal. My wife Chloe was upstairs getting ready for work. I called her down and repeated what Ethan had said. She laughed and suggested maybe Nolan had been watching a food safety documentary and Ethan overheard something out of context. She kissed Ethan's head and told him Daddy's pancakes were perfectly safe and delicious. Ethan picked up his fork reluctantly and took one small bite. He chewed slowly like he was testing for poison, then set the fork down and said his stomach hurt. Chloe gave me a concerned look but said kids went through picky phases. She suggested making him toast instead. I made the toast, and Ethan ate it without complaint. The pancakes sat untouched until I scraped them into the trash. The incident might have been forgettable, except it kept happening. 2 days later, I made spaghetti with meat sauce for dinner. Ethan loved spaghetti, and usually asked for seconds. That evening, he sat at the table and stared at his plate without touching his fork. Chloe asked if he was feeling okay, and he nodded but didn't move. I told him to eat, and he said very quietly that Grandpa Nolan said, "Daddy sometimes forgets to cook meat all the way." He said raw meat could make you very sick, and maybe even die. My hand froze halfway to my own fork. I asked Ethan when Grandpa Nolan told him this, and he said during their playdate that afternoon. Nolan was Chloe's stepfather. Her biological father had left when she was 3, and her mother married Nolan when Chloe was 6. He'd raised her from childhood, and she considered him her real dad. Nolan was retired military with rigid standards for everything. He'd been involved in our lives since Chloe and I started dating 8 years ago. He came over twice a week to spend time with Ethan and frequently gave unsolicited advice about parenting, home maintenance, and finances. I'd always found him overbearing, but harmless. Now I was reconsidering that assessment. I cut open Ethan's meatball to show him it was thoroughly cooked. No pink anywhere. Completely brown throughout. I explained that Daddy always made sure meat was cooked properly. Ethan looked at the meatball and then at me with these worried eyes. He said Grandpa Nolan told him that sometimes it looks cooked on the outside but isn't safe on the inside. He said you can't always tell just by looking. Chloe intervened and said her father probably mentioned food safety in general terms without meaning to scare Ethan. She suggested we call Nolan and clear up the misunderstanding. I agreed, and she dialed him on speaker. Nolan answered cheerfully and asked how his favorite grandson was doing. Chloe explained that Ethan was refusing to eat the spaghetti because he was worried about undercooked meat. There was a pause. Then Nolan said he'd been trying to educate Ethan about food safety because he'd noticed I sometimes rushed through cooking when I got home late from work. His tone was concerned and paternal. He said he didn't mean to alarm anyone, but children should understand the importance of proper food preparation. Chloe asked if he'd specifically told Ethan that my cooking might make him sick. Nolan said he'd mentioned that everyone needed to be careful with food preparation, not just me specifically. He suggested that maybe Ethan had misunderstood or conflated different conversations. The explanation sounded reasonable on the surface, but something about it made my skin prickle. I thanked him for caring about Ethan's safety and asked him to please not discuss food safety with Ethan anymore, since it was causing unnecessary anxiety. Nolan agreed pleasantly and said he'd be more careful about what topics he brought up. After we hung up, Chloe told Ethan that Grandpa meant well, but sometimes adults worried too much. She said Daddy's cooking was always safe and he needed to trust us. Ethan eventually ate a few bites of spaghetti but left most of it on his plate. That night, I lay awake wondering if I was overreacting to an innocent misunderstanding or if something darker was happening. The food refusal intensified over the following weeks. Ethan started asking detailed questions about how I prepared each meal. He wanted to know exact cooking temperatures and times. He'd watch me cook with this intense scrutiny that seemed unnatural for a 5-year-old. When I'd serve dinner, he'd poke at it suspiciously before taking tiny, hesitant bites. Sometimes he'd eat normally. Other times he'd claim his stomach hurt and push the plate away. Chloe took him to the pediatrician twice, convinced he had a gastrointestinal issue. The doctor found nothing wrong and suggested the problem might be behavioral or anxiety-related. She recommended keeping a food diary to identify patterns. I started documenting everything Ethan ate or refused. Within 2 weeks, a clear pattern emerged. Ethan only refused food I'd prepared. He ate everything Chloe made without question. He ate school lunches and snacks at friends' houses with no issues. His fear was specifically and exclusively directed at my cooking. I showed Chloe the food diary, and she stared at it for a long time. She said this didn't make sense unless Ethan had developed some kind of psychological association between me and food anxiety. I said, or unless someone was deliberately teaching him to fear my cooking. Chloe's face went tight. She asked if I was suggesting her father was intentionally sabotaging our family. I said I didn't know what I was suggesting, but the timing of Ethan's behavior change coincided exactly with Nolan's food safety comments. Chloe defended her father and said he'd never deliberately harm Ethan or undermine me. She said I was being paranoid and looking for someone to blame for what was probably just a childhood phase. I decided to pay closer attention to Nolan's interactions with Ethan. The next time Nolan came to pick up Ethan for their weekly outing, I suggested staying home to spend time with both of them. Nolan's face flickered with annoyance before smoothing into a pleasant smile. He said he'd planned to take Ethan to the science museum, and it might be boring for me since I'd been there before. I said I didn't mind and would enjoy the family time. The three of us drove to the museum in Nolan's car. During the drive, Nolan asked Ethan what he'd eaten for breakfast. Ethan said Mommy made him scrambled eggs. Nolan asked if Daddy ever made breakfast anymore, and Ethan said sometimes, but he usually wasn't very hungry when Daddy cooked. Nolan made this sympathetic sound and said it was okay to listen to your body. He said if your tummy told you not to eat something, you should trust that feeling. I interrupted and asked Nolan why he was encouraging Ethan to distrust his own father's cooking. Nolan looked at me in the rearview mirror with exaggerated surprise. He said he wasn't doing any such thing. He was simply teaching Ethan to listen to his instincts, which was an important life skill. I said Ethan's instincts were fine before Nolan started talking to him about food safety. Nolan's jaw tightened. He said perhaps I was feeling defensive because I knew my cooking skills weren't the best and didn't want to admit it. The comment was delivered casually, but landed like a slap. Ethan looked between us with growing anxiety. I forced myself to stay calm and said we'd discuss this later without Ethan present. The rest of the museum visit was tense and uncomfortable. Nolan made a point of buying Ethan lunch at the museum cafe and commenting on how fresh and properly prepared the food looked. Ethan ate everything without hesitation. That evening, I told Chloe that her father was absolutely doing this intentionally. I described the conversation in the car and how Nolan had specifically encouraged Ethan to trust his gut feelings about not eating my food. Chloe looked torn between defending her father and acknowledging the problem. She said maybe Nolan didn't realize how his words were affecting Ethan. I asked how many times someone needed to specifically undermine my relationship with our son before it counted as intentional. Chloe flinched at my tone. She said she'd talk to her father seriously and make clear that his behavior needed to stop. I asked if she actually believed he was doing this on purpose, or if she was just placating me. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she admitted she didn't know what to believe anymore. Her father had always been protective and sometimes overbearing, but she'd never known him to be malicious. She asked what possible reason he'd have to make Ethan fear my cooking. I said I'd been asking myself the same question and hadn't found a satisfying answer. Maybe he didn't approve of me as a husband and father. Maybe he resented losing influence over Chloe after we got married. Maybe he had some psychological issue I didn't understand. Whatever the reason, the behavior was damaging Ethan and needed to stop immediately. Chloe promised to have a serious conversation with Nolan the next day. She asked me to give her a chance to handle it within the family before we escalated to more drastic measures. I agreed reluctantly because I wanted to believe this could be resolved through honest communication. Chloe called her father the next morning and spoke to him for over an hour. I could hear her voice rising and falling from my home office, but couldn't make out specific words. When she came to find me afterward, her eyes were red from crying. She said Nolan had denied everything and claimed I was trying to turn her against him. He'd said I was jealous of his close relationship with Ethan and looking for excuses to limit their time together. He'd suggested that maybe I was the one with psychological issues that needed addressing. Chloe said she'd pressed him on the specific comments Ethan had repeated, and Nolan insisted they were taken out of context or misremembered. He'd accused Chloe of choosing her husband over her father and said he was hurt and disappointed by her lack of trust. The conversation had ended with Nolan saying he needed space to reconsider his role in our lives if he wasn't going to be respected and valued. Chloe was devastated by the conflict between her father and her husband. She said she felt trapped between two people she loved and didn't know how to fix the situation. I told her I understood this was painful, but we needed to prioritize Ethan's well-being above everything else. If Nolan couldn't respect basic boundaries, we needed to limit his access to Ethan until he could. Chloe nodded, but I could see the grief on her face. She was losing her father over this, and part of her still couldn't fully believe he was capable of the manipulation I was describing. Nolan stayed away for 2 weeks after that conversation. No visits, no phone calls, no texts asking about Ethan. Chloe was hurt by the silence and checked her phone constantly hoping for contact. I felt relieved by his absence and hoped the break would give everyone perspective. Ethan's eating habits improved slightly. He still showed hesitation towards some of my meals, but ate more consistently than before. I'd started having him help me cook so he could see the entire preparation process. We'd check temperatures together with a meat thermometer and talk about food safety in age-appropriate terms. The involvement seemed to reduce his anxiety. Then Nolan showed up unannounced on a Saturday morning. He rang the doorbell and stood on our porch holding a gift bag and wearing an apologetic expression. Chloe opened the door, and he immediately pulled her into a hug. He said he'd been wrong to withdraw and had done a lot of thinking. He apologized for being defensive and said he wanted to repair the relationship. He asked if he could spend some time with Ethan to reconnect. Chloe looked at me over her father's shoulder. I could see the hope and uncertainty in her eyes. I knew she desperately wanted her father back in their lives. I also knew I couldn't forbid the visit without causing a massive fight with Chloe. I nodded reluctantly. Nolan came inside and gave Ethan the gift. It was a toy microscope kit that Ethan had been wanting for months. Ethan's face lit up, and he hugged his grandfather. Nolan suggested they set it up together in Ethan's room. I said they could set it up in the living room where everyone could see. Nolan's smile tightened, but he agreed. I watched them assemble the microscope while Chloe made coffee in the kitchen. Nolan was being charming and attentive with Ethan, discussing all the things they could examine under magnification. He mentioned looking at food samples to see bacteria and germs. He said it was amazing how many invisible things lived on everyday objects, including the food we ate. Ethan asked if there were germs on the breakfast Daddy made that morning. Nolan said there were germs on all food, but proper cooking killed the dangerous ones. He said the problem was knowing for sure if everything got cooked long enough and hot enough to kill all the bacteria. He said that's why scientists used special equipment to test food safety rather than just trusting how it looked. I stood up and said this conversation needed to end right now. Nolan looked at me with innocent confusion. He said he was teaching Ethan about microbiology. I said he was teaching Ethan to fear my cooking under the guise of science education. Nolan's expression hardened. He said if I was so concerned about Ethan's education, maybe I should pay more attention to proper food handling instead of getting defensive about constructive feedback. Chloe came back from the kitchen and immediately sensed the tension. She asked what was happening, and I explained that Nolan was already back to planting fear about my cooking within 30 minutes of being here. Chloe looked at her father and asked if that was true. Nolan said absolutely not. He said he'd been having an innocent conversation about science, and I was twisting his words because I wanted to keep him away from Ethan. He told Chloe she needed to decide whether she believed her paranoid husband or her father who'd raised her and loved her unconditionally. The manipulation was so blatant, I felt rage surge through my chest. Chloe asked Nolan to leave. Her voice was shaking but firm. She said she needed time to process everything and he needed to respect our boundaries. Nolan stood slowly and looked at her with this expression of profound hurt and betrayal. He said he never thought he'd see the day when his own daughter chose a man over her father. He said he'd sacrificed everything to raise her after her real father abandoned them. He'd worked 2 jobs to pay for her education and had been there for every important moment of her life. Now she was throwing him away because her insecure husband couldn't handle a grandfather's natural concern for his grandson's safety. Chloe's face crumpled. She said this wasn't about choosing anyone. It was about protecting Ethan from confusion and anxiety. Nolan said if she truly believed he was harming his own grandson, then she didn't know him at all. He picked up his jacket and walked out without saying goodbye to Ethan. Ethan started crying and asked why Grandpa left angry. Chloe picked him up and held him while tears ran down her own face. I stood in the living room feeling like I'd just won and lost something simultaneously. Nolan was gone, but the damage to my family was extensive and maybe permanent. Chloe put Ethan down for a nap even though it was mid-morning. She just needed him calm and quiet. Then she locked herself in our bedroom. I heard her crying through the door and knew better than to intrude. She needed space to grieve what was happening. The next 2 months were the hardest of our marriage. Chloe was angry at me for forcing the confrontation, even though she logically understood it had been necessary. She was angry at her father for creating the situation in the first place. Mostly, she was angry at herself for not seeing the manipulation sooner and for still doubting whether it was real. She'd go back and forth between believing Nolan was deliberately sabotaging us and thinking maybe we'd all overreacted to innocent comments. I documented every interaction and every instance of Ethan's food refusal to build a factual record. The pattern remained clear and consistent. Ethan's anxiety about my cooking continued, even with Nolan completely absent from our lives. The fear had been successfully implanted and was now self-sustaining. I took Ethan to a child psychologist named Dr. Raymond Shaw, who specialized in anxiety disorders. Dr. Shaw met with Ethan 3 times before calling Chloe and me in for a parent consultation. He said Ethan had developed a specific phobia around contaminated food that was focused exclusively on meals I prepared. He said this kind of targeted fear didn't develop naturally. It required consistent external reinforcement from someone Ethan trusted. He asked if there had been any actual incidents of food poisoning or illness that might have triggered the phobia. I explained the situation with Nolan and showed Dr. Shaw my documentation. He reviewed the patterns carefully and said this was consistent with intentional psychological manipulation. He said the good news was that phobias created through suggestion could be dismantled through proper therapy. He outlined a treatment plan involving exposure therapy and cognitive behavioral techniques. He said Ethan would need to see him weekly for several months. The therapy sessions were grueling for everyone. Dr. Shaw had me prepare simple meals in his office kitchen while Ethan watched. We'd talk through each step, and Ethan would voice his fears. Dr. Shaw helped him challenge those fears with logic and evidence. Slowly, painfully, Ethan began eating small portions of food I prepared during sessions. The progress was encouraging, but heartbreaking. I was having to prove to my own 5-year-old son that I wasn't trying to poison him. The absurdity and injustice of it made me want to track down Nolan and do something I'd regret. Chloe attended most sessions, and I watched her process the reality of what her father had done. She couldn't deny it anymore when she heard Ethan articulate his specific fears in clinical setting. Ethan would say things like, "Daddy might not wash his hands enough," or, "Sometimes Daddy forgets to cook things long enough," and Dr. Shaw would ask where he learned these ideas. Ethan would say, "Grandpa Nolan taught him about food safety." The evidence was irrefutable and devastating. After one particularly difficult session, Chloe sat in the parking lot and sobbed. She said she felt like her entire childhood had been a lie. If her father could manipulate her son this way, what had he done to her over the years without her realizing? I held her and let her grieve. There were no words that could make this better. She'd lost her father not to death or distance, but to the realization that he was someone she'd never truly known. Meanwhile, Nolan started a campaign of indirect contact. He couldn't reach us directly because Chloe had blocked his number and email. Instead, he went through family members and mutual friends. Chloe's Aunt Beverly called, saying Nolan was devastated and confused about why we'd cut him off. Beverly said Nolan claimed we'd misunderstood some innocent conversations and were keeping Ethan from him over nothing. She begged Chloe to reconsider and at least let Nolan explain himself. Chloe tried to explain the situation, but Beverly was skeptical. She said Nolan had been a wonderful father and grandfather for years, and it didn't make sense that he'd suddenly start manipulating anyone. She suggested marriage counseling for Chloe and me, rather than blaming a grieving elderly man. Other relatives called with similar messages. Nolan had positioned himself as the victim of our unreasonable behavior. He'd told everyone that I was controlling and had convinced Chloe to abandon her family. Some relatives believed him immediately. Others were uncertain, but gave him benefit of doubt. A few supported our decision after hearing the full story, but they were the minority. Chloe felt isolated and attacked by people she'd considered safe. She stopped answering calls from anyone with her family's last name. The social consequences of protecting our son were severe and ongoing. Then the gifts started arriving. Packages would appear on our doorstep addressed to Ethan from Grandpa Nolan. Toys, books, clothes, all things Ethan would love. Each package included a note saying how much Nolan missed him and hoped to see him soon. Ethan would find the packages and ask why Grandpa sent presents, but didn't visit. We tried explaining that Grandpa had done something that hurt our family and needed to stay away until he could be safe. Ethan didn't understand. He just knew he missed his grandfather and wanted to see him. The gifts were tactical. Nolan knew they'd create longing and confusion in Ethan. They'd make us look like the bad guys keeping a loving grandfather away from his grandson. I wanted to refuse the packages or return them, but Chloe said that would just make things worse. We put them in a closet unopened and told Ethan he could have them when he was older and better understood the situation. Ethan cried and said we were being mean. He didn't understand why presents from Grandpa were different from presents from anyone else. Dr. Shaw said this was part of the manipulation's long-term impact. Nolan had created a situation where any boundary we set looked like cruelty. The damage extended far beyond the food phobia into Ethan's ability to trust us as parents who made decisions in his best interest. 4 months after cutting contact with Nolan, I came home from work to find Chloe's car gone and a note on the kitchen counter. The note said she'd taken Ethan to her father's house to try to resolve this situation once and for all. She said she couldn't live with the family division anymore and needed to confront Nolan directly with Dr. Shaw's findings. She promised to keep Ethan safe and would be home before dinner. I felt my blood pressure spike. I tried calling her, but she didn't answer. I tried texting and got no response. I knew where Nolan lived, but driving over there felt like exactly the kind of confrontation that could escalate into something dangerous. I called Dr. Shaw instead and asked what I should do. He said to give Chloe space to handle this her way, but be ready to intervene if necessary. He said sometimes family members needed to face the manipulation source directly to fully process and accept the reality. I spent the next 3 hours pacing our living room and checking my phone every 30 seconds. Finally, around 6 o'clock, I heard Chloe's car in the driveway. I went outside and saw Ethan asleep in his car seat. Chloe got out, and her face was puffy from crying. She said we needed to talk after we put Ethan to bed. The drive to Nolan's house had been impulsive and emotional, but what happened there had clarified everything. After Ethan was settled in his room, Chloe sat across from me at the kitchen table and described the confrontation. She'd arrived at Nolan's house with printed copies of Dr. Shaw's clinical notes and the documentation I'd compiled. She'd told her father she wanted to understand why he'd done this to our family. Nolan had initially maintained his innocence and said we were exaggerating innocent conversations. Chloe had pushed back with specific examples and dates. She'd read portions of Dr. Shaw's evaluation aloud, including Ethan's direct quotes about what Grandpa taught him regarding food safety. She'd asked Nolan to explain how Ethan knew such specific and consistent details if Nolan hadn't deliberately taught them. Nolan's defense had crumbled slowly. He'd started admitting that maybe he'd been overly cautious about food preparation. Maybe he'd projected his military standards onto civilian situations, but he still insisted he'd never meant to harm anyone. Chloe had asked him directly, "Did you or did you not tell Ethan that his father's cooking might be dangerous?" There was a long silence. Then Nolan admitted he might have implied that I wasn't as careful as I should be about food safety. Chloe asked why he would imply such things to a 5-year-old child. Nolan's face had changed at that question. The careful control slipped and something cold appeared underneath. He'd said I wasn't good enough for his daughter. I didn't meet his standards as a husband or father. I worked too much and didn't prioritize family properly. I was careless and mediocre, and Chloe had settled when she married me. Chloe said hearing her father articulate his true feelings had been both devastating and liberating. She finally understood the manipulation wasn't about food safety or concern for Ethan. It was about Nolan's resentment toward me and his desire to undermine our marriage. By making Ethan fear my cooking, Nolan was creating a wedge between father and son. He was demonstrating that I couldn't perform even basic parental functions competently. He was building evidence that Chloe should leave me and find someone more worthy. The long-term goal had been to destroy our marriage and regain full control over his daughter and grandson. Chloe had asked him how he could do something so cruel to his own grandson in service of such a petty vendetta. Nolan had said Ethan would thank him eventually when Chloe came to her senses and left me. He'd said a temporary fear of one parent's cooking was minor compared to growing up with an inadequate father. Chloe had grabbed Ethan and walked out without another word. She'd driven around for an hour, processing what she'd heard before coming home. Now she sat across from me and said she was done defending her father. She said we needed to formalize the no-contact boundary and prepare for Nolan to escalate his attempts at contact. She said she was ready to do whatever was necessary to protect our family from further harm. I reached across the table and took her hand. I told her I was sorry she'd had to hear those things from her father. She squeezed my hand and said she'd needed to hear them. Without that confrontation, she would have always wondered if we'd overreacted or misjudged the situation. We consulted with a family law attorney the following week. We explained the situation and asked about options for protecting Ethan from Nolan's influence. The attorney said we could pursue a restraining order based on psychological abuse, but the bar for approval was high, and the evidence was largely testimonial. He suggested instead that we draft a formal cease and desist letter outlining Nolan's behavior and our expectations. The letter would document everything and establish a paper trail if we needed to pursue legal action later. We agreed, and the attorney drafted a detailed letter listing specific incidents of manipulation, the impact on Ethan's mental health, Dr. Shaw's clinical findings, and our demand that Nolan cease all contact with our family. The letter stated that any attempt to contact Ethan directly or indirectly would be considered harassment and would result in legal action. We had the letter delivered by certified mail to ensure Nolan couldn't claim he never received it. The attorney also advised us to document any future contact attempts with dates, times, and content. He said to save all gifts, letters, emails, or other communications. If we ended up in court, we'd need evidence of a pattern of behavior after being explicitly told to stop. I felt like we were preparing for war against a family member, which was grotesque, but necessary. Nolan responded to the cease and desist by hiring his own attorney. We received a letter claiming we were engaging in parental alienation by keeping Ethan from his grandfather. The letter accused us of making false allegations to justify cutting off a loving family relationship. It threatened legal action for grandparents' rights. I didn't even know grandparents had legal rights until that letter arrived. Our attorney explained that some states allowed grandparents to petition for visitation rights in certain circumstances. The bar was high and required proving that denial of access would harm the child. Nolan's attorney would have to demonstrate that continued contact with Nolan was in Ethan's best interest, despite our objections. Our attorney said we had strong counterarguments, including Dr. Shaw's clinical assessment and documentation of the manipulation. He said grandparents' rights cases were difficult to win under the best circumstances and nearly impossible when there was evidence of psychological harm. Still, we'd have to prepare for litigation. Nolan was apparently committed to fighting us through the legal system, rather than accepting boundaries. The prospect of court battles and legal fees was overwhelming. We were being punished financially and emotionally for protecting our child. Chloe was furious that her father would threaten legal action rather than simply respecting our decision. She said it confirmed everything about his controlling personality and inability to accept limits on his authority. The grandparents' rights petition was filed in August. We had 60 days to respond with our own documentation and arguments. Our attorney worked with Dr. Shaw to prepare a comprehensive report on Ethan's psychological state and the impact of Nolan's behavior. Dr. Shaw's report was clinical and damning. It detailed Ethan's phobia, traced its development to specific interactions with Nolan, and explained how continued contact would impede Ethan's recovery and potentially cause additional trauma. Dr. Shaw recommended zero contact between Ethan and Nolan until Ethan was old enough to understand the manipulation that had occurred. Even then, contact should only resume if Nolan completed extensive therapy and demonstrated genuine insight into his harmful behavior. Our attorney also included affidavits from Chloe and me describing specific incidents. We included the food diary showing Ethan's selective refusal of meals I prepared. We included copies of Nolan's gifts and notes. We included recordings of voicemails from family members relaying Nolan's messages despite the cease and desist. The response document was over 100 pages of evidence that Nolan had deliberately and systematically attempted to undermine my relationship with my son. Reading through it in its entirety was surreal and enraging. The accumulation of incidents painted a picture of calculated psychological abuse. I couldn't understand how someone could invest this much energy into harming a child just to punish the child's father. The court hearing was scheduled for October. In the weeks leading up to it, Nolan's campaign intensified. He started showing up at places he knew we'd be. He'd attend the same church service and sit where we could see him. He'd shop at our grocery store and walk past us in the aisles. He never approached or spoke to us. He'd just make sure we saw him and then watch our reactions. The message was clear. He wasn't going to disappear just because we'd sent legal letters. He'd be a constant presence in our lives whether we liked it or not. Ethan saw him twice. Both times, Ethan got excited and tried to run to his grandfather. We had to physically hold him back and redirect him. Ethan cried and asked why we wouldn't let him say hello. We tried explaining that Grandpa needed to stay away right now, but Ethan didn't understand. He just knew his grandfather was right there, and we were being mean by preventing contact. Each incident reinforced Nolan's narrative that we were cruel parents keeping a loving grandfather away. I started shopping at different stores and attending different church services just to avoid these encounters. The inconvenience was minor compared to the emotional toll of watching Ethan cry for his grandfather while that same grandfather stood there looking victimized and innocent. The court hearing was held on a gray October morning in family court. Nolan arrived with his attorney and several family members who were there to support him. Beverly, two of Chloe's cousins, and one of Nolan's former military buddies all sat in the gallery behind Nolan's table. On our side, it was just Chloe, me, and our attorney. Dr. Shaw was present as our expert witness. The judge was a stern woman in her 60s named Judge Caitlin Ortiz. She reviewed the submitted documents before calling the hearing to order. Nolan's attorney presented first. He argued that Nolan had been a devoted grandfather for 5 years, with no issues until I'd suddenly decided to cut off access. He claimed I was jealous of Nolan's bond with Ethan and had manufactured allegations to justify the estrangement. He presented character witnesses who testified that Nolan was kind, responsible, and loved Ethan deeply. Beverly tearfully described how devoted Nolan had always been to family and how devastated he was by the separation from his grandson. The testimony was effective and painted Nolan as a sympathetic victim. Our attorney then presented our case. He called Dr. Shaw to the stand and walked through his clinical findings. Dr. Shaw explained phobia development and how Ethan's specific fear pattern indicated external manipulation rather than natural anxiety. He described the therapy sessions and Ethan's direct statements about what Grandpa taught him. He presented his recommendation for no contact. Nolan's attorney cross-examined Dr. Shaw aggressively. He asked if Dr. Shaw had personally witnessed any of the alleged manipulation. Dr. Shaw said no, he was relying on the child's consistent testimony and the parents' documentation. Nolan's attorney suggested that maybe the parents had coached Ethan to say those things to support their false narrative. Dr. Shaw explained that children Ethan's age couldn't maintain consistent false testimony across multiple sessions without contradictions. He said Ethan's accounts had been spontaneous and detailed in ways that indicated genuine memory rather than coaching. Nolan's attorney asked if it was possible that the parents had created the food phobia through their own anxiety and were now blaming Nolan. Dr. Shaw said that theory didn't match the evidence. Ethan showed no fear of anyone else's cooking, only mine. That specificity indicated targeted suggestion from an outside source. The cross-examination continued for 30 minutes, but Dr. Shaw remained calm and professional throughout. Next, our attorney called Chloe to testify. She described growing up with Nolan as her stepfather. She explained that he'd always been controlling and critical, but she'd accepted it as normal. She described the escalation after Ethan's birth and Nolan's increasing comments about my inadequacy as a husband and father. She testified about the confrontation at Nolan's house, where he'd admitted his true feelings about me. She said he'd explicitly stated that he wanted to drive a wedge between Ethan and me as part of a larger goal to end our marriage. Nolan's attorney cross-examined Chloe and asked why she'd maintained a close relationship with her father for 5 years if he was so controlling and manipulative. Chloe said she'd been conditioned from childhood to accept his behavior as love. She said it took seeing him target her son to finally recognize the pattern. The attorney asked if maybe she was now reinterpreting normal behavior as manipulation because her husband had convinced her to see it that way. Chloe said no. She'd resisted believing the allegations for months until the evidence became overwhelming. The attorney asked if she was willing to completely cut her own father out of her life based on her husband's insecurity. Chloe's voice went hard. She said she was willing to protect her son from psychological abuse regardless of who was perpetrating it. The attorney sat down. Then our attorney called me to testify. I walked through the timeline of Ethan's food refusal. I described specific conversations with Nolan. I presented the food diary and explained the clear pattern. I testified about the confrontation where I'd told Nolan his behavior needed to stop, and he'd responded by saying my cooking skills deserved criticism. I explained how Ethan's fear had become self-sustaining even after Nolan stopped having direct contact. I said we'd spent thousands of dollars on therapy to repair damage that Nolan had caused deliberately. Under cross-examination, Nolan's attorney asked if I'd ever considered that maybe I was actually a careless cook, and Nolan had legitimate concerns. I said every meal I prepared was safe and properly cooked. The attorney asked if I could prove that. I said I could prove there had never been a single incident of food poisoning or illness from my cooking in 5 years of marriage. The attorney asked if absence of past incidents guaranteed future safety. I said nothing in life was guaranteed, but I followed basic food safety protocols, and Ethan had no rational reason to fear my cooking. Finally, the judge asked if Nolan wanted to testify. Nolan stood and took the stand. He looked elderly and fragile sitting in the witness chair. He testified that he'd only wanted what was best for his grandson. He admitted he might have been overly cautious about food safety because of his military training. He said he'd seen foodborne illnesses devastate entire units overseas, and perhaps he'd projected those concerns onto civilian situations. He said he'd never intended to undermine me or create fear in Ethan. He claimed he'd only mentioned food safety in general terms, and Ethan must have misunderstood. He said he'd been heartbroken by our decision to cut off contact and missed his grandson desperately. He started crying on the stand. His attorney asked if he'd ever done anything to deliberately harm Ethan. Nolan said absolutely not. He loved Ethan more than anything and would never intentionally hurt him. Our attorney cross-examined him. He asked Nolan directly if he'd told Ethan that I sometimes forgot to cook meat thoroughly. Nolan hesitated, then said he might have mentioned that undercooking meat was dangerous in a general conversation. Our attorney asked if he'd told Ethan to watch my cooking carefully because I might not wash my hands enough. Nolan said he couldn't remember saying that specifically. Our attorney confronted him with Ethan's consistent testimony across multiple therapy sessions. He asked how Ethan would know these specific concerns if Nolan hadn't taught them. Nolan said children sometimes conflate different conversations. Our attorney asked about the confrontation with Chloe, where Nolan had admitted I wasn't good enough for his daughter. Nolan denied saying that. Chloe gasped audibly from our table. Our attorney asked if Nolan was calling his own daughter a liar. Nolan said Chloe must have misheard or misremembered because he'd never said I was inadequate. The judge called a recess and said she'd issue her ruling after reviewing all testimony and evidence. We waited in the hallway for 45 minutes. Nolan and his supporters sat on the opposite end, maintaining distance. Finally, we were called back into the courtroom. Judge Ortiz said she'd reviewed everything carefully and was prepared to rule. She said grandparents' rights existed to protect relationships that benefited children. However, those rights didn't supersede parental authority when parents had legitimate concerns about a child's well-being. She said the evidence presented showed a pattern of behavior that, at minimum, demonstrated poor judgment on Nolan's part. Whether his intentions were malicious or merely misguided, the impact on Ethan was documented and concerning. Dr. Shaw's testimony was credible, and his clinical findings were compelling. Most significantly, Chloe's testimony about Nolan's admission regarding his true feelings toward me indicated ulterior motives beyond food safety concerns. Judge Ortiz said that given the ongoing therapy Ethan required to address the phobia, continuing contact with the person who created that phobia would be counterproductive and potentially harmful. She denied Nolan's petition for visitation rights. She said the parents had demonstrated reasonable cause to limit contact, and she would not override their parental authority. She added that Nolan could petition again in the future if circumstances changed significantly, but for now, the no-contact boundary would stand. Nolan's face went red, and he started to stand, but his attorney pulled him back down. Judge Ortiz warned that any violation of the parents' boundaries would be grounds for a restraining order. She dismissed court. Chloe grabbed my hand and squeezed. I felt relief wash through me so intensely I nearly collapsed. We walked out of the courthouse and Nolan was waiting on the steps. His attorney was gone and so were his supporters. He stood alone looking diminished and furious. He called out to Chloe and said she'd regret this decision. He said she'd destroyed her family and would have to live with the consequences. Chloe stopped walking and turned to face him. She said he'd destroyed the family through his own choices, and she hoped he'd eventually understand that. Nolan said I'd brainwashed her and turned her against her own father. Chloe said no one had brainwashed her. She'd simply chosen to protect her son from someone who'd proven unsafe, regardless of their biological relationship. Nolan started toward us, and I stepped between him and Chloe. I told him to back away, or I'd call the police. Nolan's hands clenched into fists. He said I'd stolen his daughter and grandson and would pay for it eventually. I took out my phone and started dialing. Nolan turned and walked away, muttering. Our attorney, who'd witnessed the interaction, said he'd document it in case we needed evidence later. He said Nolan's threat could support a restraining order application if he made any further contact attempts. I thanked him, and we went home. Ethan was with a babysitter who'd kept him busy during the hearing. When we arrived, he asked if we'd seen Grandpa today. Chloe knelt down and said we had, but Grandpa still needed to stay away. Ethan accepted this with a sad nod. Dr. Shaw had been preparing him for the possibility. The therapy was working gradually. Ethan was eating my cooking more consistently and asking fewer anxious questions. The fear was fading, but the innocence we'd lost couldn't be recovered. Nolan made 3 attempts to contact us in the following months. He sent a letter through his attorney requesting reconsideration. We declined through our own attorney. He sent Christmas gifts that we returned unopened. He showed up at Ethan's school during pickup, and security had to escort him off property. That final incident prompted us to file for the restraining order. The judge granted it based on the accumulation of contact violations. Nolan was now legally forbidden from coming within 500 feet of any of us. If he violated the order, he'd be arrested. The first peaceful period began. No more gifts, letters, surprise appearances, or indirect messages through relatives. Ethan's therapy continued, and his eating habits normalized completely. He still occasionally mentioned Grandpa Nolan with sadness, but without the desperate longing he'd shown before. Dr. Shaw said Ethan was processing the loss appropriately for his age. He understood that sometimes people who love us still make choices that hurt us, and it's okay to have complicated feelings about that. Chloe grieved her father in waves. Some days she was angry, other days she was sad. She joined a support group for adult children of narcissistic parents and found community with people who understood her specific pain. She said hearing other people's stories helped her recognize the patterns she'd normalized throughout her childhood. Our marriage grew stronger through the crisis. We'd protected our family together and proven we could handle severe stress without fracturing. A year after the court ruling, Chloe received notification that Nolan had died of a heart attack. His attorney sent us the information as required by the restraining order terms. Chloe sat with the letter for a long time. She cried, but not the way she'd cried during the active conflict. These were quieter tears tinged with relief and guilt. She said she'd hoped somehow her father would eventually understand and change. Now that possibility was gone forever. I held her and said nothing because there were no words that could make this better. We told Ethan that Grandpa Nolan had died and wouldn't be able to visit ever again. Ethan was sad, but not devastated. Dr. Shaw had warned us that Ethan's attachment to Nolan had been disrupted by the long separation and manipulation revelation. The grandfather Ethan missed was partially a fantasy construct that never fully existed. We held a small private memorial with just our immediate family. Chloe said goodbye to the father she'd wanted, rather than the father she'd actually had. Beverly attended and apologized for not believing us sooner. She said going through Nolan's belongings after his death, she'd found journals documenting his obsessive anger toward me. The journals confirmed everything we'd described. She was horrified and ashamed. Chloe forgave her and said recognizing the truth now was what mattered. Some of Nolan's other relatives never came around. They continued believing he'd been the victim of our cruelty. We accepted that some relationships were permanently damaged. Ethan healed fully and learned to love my cooking. He's 8 now and sometimes asks about the time he was scared to eat my food. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.